Hi everyone, thanks for joining our webinar today. We will be getting started in just a minute here. If you have any issues with audio or video, please reach out in the chat window and we'll do what we can to help. All right. Looks like attendees are filing in, no problem. We're gonna go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, I'm Alexandra, Director of Solution Marketing at 1904 Labs. Thanks for joining us today for our virtual roundtable on approaches to mobile development. We have a great panel with us to discuss the different approaches, hybrid, native, and progressive web apps, and how to evaluate the trade-offs based on your initiative and your end goals for your mobile project. Before I turn it over to our moderator today, I'd like to go over just a few quick logistical items. This session is being recorded. We'll be sending out that recording to all registrants following the session. Everyone is muted who is participating, so please use the chat window if you have any issues, if you have questions at any time during the presentations. We would love to be able to ask them in real time, so please use that chat window freely. We're going to reserve some time at the end for Q&A also, so we'll leave some time at the end for that. We do want this to be interactive though, so comment away throughout the presentation as well. At this point, I'd like to introduce you to Julius Manganala, who is our moderator for today's panel. He is our mobile project lead at 1904 Labs and brings over 25 years of global experience in software engineering, transformation, portfolio management, sales, has a huge background across a variety of very large companies like Anheuser-Busch, AT&T, and many more. At this point, Julius, take it away.
Thank you, Alexandra. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get into it. Thank you for coming. I think I'll just kind of start really quickly about what we're going to discuss. As we all know that when you have a mobile digital strategy, engaging customers is really critical. You've got to be able to engage them for market dynamics. You also need to increase your growth and understanding, your influence, and basically having a better customer experience is really critical. So the next thing is, how do you get there? You know, in the shortest possible time, and get to begin realizing return on investments. One of the things is this is a game of inches, not miles, and it's really essential that you get early understanding of who your customer is for greater impact downstream. And you know, this is about efficiencies, not effort. So these are some of the things we'll be covering in later podcasts or later webinars. But today we're really just going to really focus more on along your journey. At some point you're going to have to make a technical decision of some kind, several technical decisions. And this is kind of where we're going to focus on today. So we're going to be talking about popular platforms being used in mobile devices today, which is native, hybrid, and progressive web apps. So we have that. We've kind of now know what we're going to be talking about, technical decisions and how we arrive at some of those. And just to kind of give you a bit of a background here, we at 1904, the mobile team and other different parts of modern software engineering and data engineering and decision science have been constantly engaged in innovation efforts. And that means research, writing software, and how that gets realized is either in working software, libraries, utilities, some of which may be open source, and other products that we basically get to help our clients with. And some of that also comes realized as artifacts, which is what you're kind of looking at today. This is a mobile application decision guide, which basically across the three different platforms we're discussing have a lot of factors that can help influence how you go about choosing what platform to use. There's several factors like performance, upfront costs, total cost of ownership, and overall risk. So we'll be kind of diving into some of those today. And so let's kick it into gear. So we have three great panelists today, and I'll just go ahead and let's get them introduced before we jump into our first questions. Connor Besancini is a 1904 Labs mobile software engineer. Say hello, Connor.
Yeah, hey, my name's Connor Besancini. I'm a mobile developer for 1904, more specifically for iOS. I specialize in native approaches, and I've worked in many industries such as healthcare, fintech, e-commerce, and many others.
Thank you, Connor. Next, we have Nathan Causey, who is an enterprise mobility architect with Edward Jones. Now, Edward Jones is a financial services firm who served nearly 7 million investors. A great deal of their success has been based on their principles and a personal long-term approach to investing. Say hello there, Nathan.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, Julius and 1904 Labs for inviting me to do the webinar today. Certainly a great thanks to you guys. I have been in the industry for over 20 years. I've worked in telecom, retail, and finance, and been doing mobility both in the enterprise and customer facing space since 2010. So quite well versed in this topic. So thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Next on the panel is the man to watch for tomorrow's innovations, Ken Zhang, who is the Chief Executive Officer for Takoda, who's a young health startup, tech startup that's building technology tools that assist professional therapists monitor and treat patients suffering from substance use and psychiatric disorders. Hi, Ken.
Hey, Julius, good to be here. And thanks for the invite. I have founded 3 technology startups that have had software products with mobile applications. And so I'm really excited to talk about what we're talking about today.
All right. You know, for those of you who like manual transmission cars, let's let go of the clutch and get going. So, first question. Nathan, I think I'll start with you. What's your favorite mobile app?
That would be hard to answer, I think, but I can't say the one I'm building currently and can't talk about. But as far as the one I use a lot and I think is pretty well centered for simplicity and it has a great UI, it's Coinbase. It's a cryptocurrency trading platform I use pretty much daily. Very minimalistic, like 3 main views that you really get at the data very quickly, and it gets to the point and it works very well. So I would have to say that's probably my favorite mobile application. So
nice. What say you, Connor?
Yeah, so my favorite one is one that I don't get to use too much right now. It's a navigation app called Waze. I think one reason it's so great is because the way they obtain and crowdsource information. It's one thing to have a great app. It's another to see a community come together and kind of provide the data and the experience for other users. So I'd have to go with Waze. Unfortunately, I don't get to use it too much at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great app. If you've ever been stuck in traffic on your way trying to get to an airport, it can certainly save your day. Ken?
Yeah, I would say right now it's actually Slack, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with in terms of having a workplace tool for communication with employees and fellow coworkers. I think, I've used Slack for about 4 years now on both desktop and mobile, and it's been a pretty cool experience to see how they've grown from a really strappy sort of communication startup to now serving a lot of enterprise clients and the morphs that UI has gone through in order to facilitate the change.
Slack is really one of the really good apps out there. And it's kind of interesting how once you start using it, it kind of takes over very many facets of your life. So outside work, there's very many different groups, be it sporting groups and other kinds of groups. So it's a really good social connection tool. Great. Let's go to the next one. So kind of starting that off as the base, Ken, I guess we'll kind of stick with you. We're not asking you to give away the farm here, but what's at least one ingredient in your secret sauce to a great mobile experience?
I think for us, as a technology company, and I mean, just to give a little background on Dakota, I mean, we're looking at patients who are recovering from substance use disorder and addiction issues that they're facing in their lives, right? And so one thing that we've really tried to keep in mind as we make any of our decisions is the sort of cognitive state of that patient and how we create interfaces that are very relevant for them in their recovery experience. And so someone who recently, stopped using substances might have a really different view on how they interact with technology than someone like, most of us in the room here. And so I think keeping that customer experience in mind is certainly what we've had to focus on, and whether that's, making things very simple and easy to grasp instead of, a more slick and complex interface. That would be one example, is something that we've really tried to focus on for our experiences.
Yeah, user experience is a really, really big one, and that's like we talked about it, getting to engage with your audience in whatever product you have is a big one, a really big one. Connor?
Yeah, I would also have to agree with user experience and design. I think they go hand in hand. I think it's one thing to have, a really interesting set of features, but if it doesn't perform well on each platform and perform to a standard that, iOS or Android users expect, then it doesn't necessarily matter how interesting your features are, how interesting the concept of your app is. So simplicity, I think, is a big thing, and making sure that your users are familiar. So when new design guidelines come out for each platform, I think it's important that you stay up to date for each and every platform that you're publishing to. So I'd have to also agree with user experience and design. I think they go very hand in hand with a good experience.
Yeah, there are a lot of applications that, when you think about it, either you're walking or you're walking outside somewhere because you have your winter gloves on. There are a lot of things that come into experience for sure. What say you, Nathan?
Yeah, I hate to beat a dead horse, but it's going to be listening to your customers, what they need, and making sure you're fulfilling that with the mobile application, because honestly, mobile is not meant to be like a holistic web experience. It's supposed to get something done very quickly, very efficiently for our customers. And if you're going to put this out in their hands, you need to do like experiments, A/B testing, things like that, get feedback, do things on your feedback, make sure it's not crashing. So, and even we go into looking up even building the app, we talk to the people that are going to use it and say, here's a concept. What would you want in this concept? And let them give you some direction to even get started. So,
right. And out in the world, there's always the question. There's always been products throughout our life experiences that I don't know if you guys have had the expression, the product that answered the question that nobody ever asked and nobody will ever ask again because it was probably a bad idea. Just outside innovation, but good. So, Nathan, give us like a factor, give us something that you consider when deciding on what you're gonna go build.
Some of the factors I would consider obviously is time to market, your budget, your current what you have in house. Do you have developers that are well versed in a certain technology already? For example, if you have only I worked at a retail grocery store chain, and all we had was web developers at that time, and they really didn't know, at that time, Objective-C. We knew Java, but we didn't know Objective-C. So we went with a hybrid solution at first, because we knew JavaScript. We could all code in JavaScript. So, there could be several things I would say, just looking at your holistic thing, what are you trying to get at and what are you trying to build? If it's very simplistic, it's a one-page application, maybe you can use a hybrid approach. If you're going to customers in the App Store and the Play Store, I'm probably going to say you're going to do a native application, especially if you're going to use things like GPS or the camera or things like that. So,
Ken, any thoughts over?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that I think about here is what stage is the company that I'm, in this case, founding for Dakota. What stage is that company at? And so And of course, I think echoing what Nathan said, what capabilities do we require? And so one of the things we always thought about was GPS as well. And so that sort of led us down that native development path to doing native iOS and native Android. But also as a really young company, it's like, how do you stretch the resources and the capacity of the people that you have working with you, because you don't have the ability to spend, you know, a 7-figure budget on creating this application, or a 6 or 7-figure budget. And so that's always a really interesting trade-off. And ultimately for us, we ended up choosing native development because we wanted that extensible and you know, future-proofing what we're doing with our work. But we definitely considered strongly going one of the, you know, React Native, or even just a responsive web app or progressive web app. We considered that very heavily before ultimately choosing the native options.
Oh yeah, pragmatism is something that we really got to have, you know, when kind of going through these things. Connor, being in the trenches, what do you think about how are things out in the fields?
Yeah, so there's two lenses that you can kind of look at things through. The business standpoint, one of the big things I would think about is, who am I targeting? There's a lot of data around, you know, what age group, you know, what region uses what type of platform the most, US being like majority iOS, but the world being majority Android. So those are things to consider if you're developing something, you know, for a different country or just the United States. Those are definitely factors you want to consider. But from a technical standpoint, I think the first thing that I look at is, you know, what technologies do I know? I think that's a very big one. And how complex of an application am I creating overall and at the beginning? Is it an MVP? Is this going to go on to be a very large enterprise application? Those things are the things that I think are at the beginning the most important. Especially the one being, what skill sets do we have in house? I agree heavily on that, because a lot of time can be burnt in the beginning trying to learn a new technology and over engineer. So I think it's very important to avoid that, and you know, go with what you know, and with, you know, taking the other things into account.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's those are really good things to consider. So, you know, pragmatic, practical, and personal. Who are you building for? Man, I feel really smart. I probably need to go take up a crossword puzzle after this. Let's see what next. What are some of the trade-offs, though? You know, given we live in a pretty dynamic environment right now. Connor, why don't we stick with you?
Yeah, so obviously, I think this comes back to complexity. When you have something that deals with very complex native components, such as Bluetooth, location, camera, and so on, those are things that you need to consider when you're deciding are you going to go native, hybrid, or PWA. Yeah, so I think that's a big one. I also think that time for your timeline, like how fast you need to develop the app, those are things that you need to consider. If it's really fast, maybe you do go for a PWA, because you can use, you know, web frameworks that a lot of people are familiar with. If you have extra time and budget, maybe you go native. If you want something that's kind of in the middle, maybe hybrid is something that you need to look at. So I think those are all really big trade-offs.
Yeah. Mr. CEO, what say you, sir? Ken?
I think that anyone who's worked with me knows that I have a strong passion for the user experience and user interfaces. And so one thing that I always think about is how much lesser is the user experience going to be if we go with one of the quicker to market options. And so I think, you know, for me, I've definitely used progressive web apps that as soon as I clicked on a button, I noticed this is not a native app, that this is a experience that is less fluid and less elegant than what a native app could offer me. And I think that's something that I'm really cognizant of, especially with a application that's going to be used by patients in this case, that I want them to, you know, have the simplest experience, like I said before. And so I think that, you know, amongst the three, for progressive web apps, I feel like I've always been able to tell that, yeah, I'm using a progressive web app. This is experience that, you know, gets the job done, but that's all there is to it. For hybrid, I do think that it is possible to, because they are oftentimes compiling down to native code, that it's possible to get an experience that essentially fools the user into thinking they're using a native app. But because you're often cross-compiling, the native paradigms that iOS and Android have, which differ, such as the back button not existing as a hardware button for iOS, for example, that's going to show up sometimes if you're using a cross-compiling platform like that. And so you'll notice those things as a user, even if subconsciously you're noticing these things, which again leads to a lesser experience. And then finally, of course, native is sort of the gold standard in terms of having that customizability and fluidity, but then of course it costs the most. So
yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's really it's really a lot you've got to kind of think about. Nathan, do you agree with all these?
I'll take my stance in this, that, you know, with the native platforms, they are set by the vendors that support those OSs, you know, and they're never going away, although they did change our, you know, coding languages under the scenes from Objective-C to Swift, and, you know, went from Java to Kotlin. The platform itself is owned by those, you know, the owners of the OSs, the manufacturers of the OSs. So that you tend to know that tool set is going to stay. And these cross-platform tools, I've seen that change over time. You know, it started with like Accelerator Titanium, now it's Flutter, now it's React Native. Are they going to be around forever? I don't know. And that scares me sometimes. And they always seem to be playing catch up in my mind to their native counterparts, because they're never, you know, if Xcode comes out with a deployment today, they're not going to necessarily have that ability for you that next day. You know, to me, it's always and progressive web apps are like, I want to go with what Ken said, is I would tend not to use those in the enterprise setting unless it was something so simplistic. We just needed to give something with a website to somebody that said, you know, quick and dirty for a vendor or something. It wouldn't be to go out to customers or something like that, in my opinion. That's kind of my take on it.
Hey, that's good stuff. You know, risk resiliency, right? So if you have technologies that are kind of switching out under you, and you have to respond to change, whatever that change is, yeah, you could be in trouble. Right. So just to remind everyone, some of you were joining, we are having a good discussion here on what platforms what decisions you've got to make when choosing between native, progressive web app, and hybrid platforms. And we've got Connor Abisenzani from 1904 Labs, Nathan Causey from Edward Jones, and Ken Zeng from Takoda. Connor, we'll start with you. Let's get into second gear with you. Give us a quick window. Give us a quick look into the window of some of your successes there. What approaches did you take, and how did those work out really well?
Yeah, so, you know, every time I start an iOS project, I typically like to look at the requirements and match those to the skill sets that I know. A good example, for instance, is Swift UI coming out for iOS and its increase in popularity. If I were to start an app right now and I needed it to be an enterprise application, I would definitely take a look at, okay, am I comfortable enough with these new frameworks iOS is providing? If so, do these frameworks allow me to accomplish, you know, the requirements for this app? So I think that the main thing I do is just take a look at requirements. I don't try and over-engineer at the beginning or go outside of my comfort zone and use a technology that I'm not quite ready with, unless I'm building something to test or learn. But if I was to build an enterprise application, I think it's very important to stick with what you know and what you know you can be successful with. So every app, I just kind of start with the checklist of all my requirements and match those to you know, the technologies that I know best.
Nice. Wise words from a wise man. Ken?
Yeah, I think jumping off of Connor's answer, one of my previous startups, it was a pet industry. It was an application for pet owners to be able to connect more easily and more sociably with each other. And ultimately, I think it actually turned into you know, a very robust product that's still in development today. But at the beginning, one of the things we did was evaluate React Native versus true native development. We ended up going with full native, but basically one of our engineers did a 1-week sort of hackathon to try to put what we needed for the GPS functionality into a React Native product. And they found that it was just lacking some of the native APIs that we needed access to. And I think doing a spike like that is really useful in order to figure out what the limitations of, you know, the project that you're working on. And if you already know those requirements up front, and those were just for the MVP, right? So not even talking about the versions 2, 3, and 4 that we would want to build afterwards. That you know, then figuring out the nature of the limitations, and then deciding whether that's something you can work around or not, is something that, you know, if we had gone down that path, it would have taken us maybe a few months if we were moving slowly and cautiously, but we sort of just busted down that roadblock up front and made a decision based on a well-informed spike that they did. So
Great. For some of us who are less technically inclined or software development process inclined, do you mind just kind of unpacking what a spike is?
Sure. I define a spike as a story that generally has a time limit. So in this case, because we were working part-time on the startup, we said, okay, we're gonna have a week to figure out, make a decision on this particular question. And it's generally a task that is more amorphous. Instead of make button A do this, which is generally what a development story is, a spike is, you know, sort of figure out if this is the right tool to use, and you have a time box of a week to do it, or, you know, figure out if this is even possible, you know, a more sort of abstract but still well-defined, you know, in terms of what is its completion, but a more abstract story that a developer has to work on.
Yeah, story spikes, that's all something not so much out of a Mother Goose novel or kid story. It's something, it's part of the agile process. You know, please reach out to 1904 Labs. We actually, I digress a little, but we do have a methodology that we've developed, HCD Agile. There's tons of literature you can find on it on 1904labs.com. So yeah, please do reach out and engage. Nathan, do you have something for us there? What's your success?
Sure.
Give us a peek in that window.
Boy, you know, I get success by all the developers that help me build everything today, because being an architect, I don't get my hands as dirty as I'd like to anymore. But early on in my career, I was at the Save-A-Lot, which is a grocery store chain. We did not have Macs or anything, and we got the budget to buy 2 Macs. And we actually did not know native development, and we did want to do a cross-platform application. So we wrote something called the SAL field tool. And we did it for upper management because we did not have a customer-facing app at the time in the App Store or anything. So what we did is we like geo-coordinated all of our stores, locations, and we aggregated a bunch of data into SQL Server. And we built a little web application that was responsive and nice. And then we wrapped it in this, you know, Accelerator titanium kind of wrapper. It had GPS involved in the camera. So we can scan barcodes. We can look up like inventory real time in the store with the phone. We can tell you how your store is comparing to the nearest 10 stores around you, and aggregated all that data and gave it to upper management. And we did it pretty quickly. I think we had that probably done in 2 months and got it in people's hands, and it floored them what we put on the phone. It was in 2010. So that was a little early on. It was a long time ago, and they were like amazed that that can happen. They were like, "What? I can go scan something and tell you if it's moving like the way it should be?" I'm like, "Yeah, you can. Just go scan the barcode." Very interesting.
That's great. Yeah, that's really, really great. You know, some of the themes here that I'm kind of getting from some of you to kind of play back is, you know, get into the sandbox, prototype, do some research, and also just kind of work with what you have. It's really about innovation as a mindset and a way of doing things, not just being prescriptive and deciding there's only one way to skin a cat or cow or a bird, but birds have feathers, so you can't quite skin them that effectively. Next thing.
We do have a question from the audience. Jake is asking, he's wondering if any of the panelists have run into situations where a hybrid solution was unable to utilize a native feature on a given device. Does anybody have any perspectives on that?
I can speak to a little bit. I don't know necessarily if I've ran into an issue where a feature just was not supported. I know that there are scenarios where things are hard to get around and you have to use other platforms or technologies to kind of do workarounds for those features. But as far as like native elements, because if you are developing for native, you're going to always be, whenever Apple or Android release something, you're going to have it right away. But if you want to have that same thing for React Native or Flutter or any of these other technologies, there might be a waiting period. And because of that, you might have to resort to some third-party library. So I have ran into instances where something as simple as, a tab bar or something isn't supported out of the box and you have to resort to using either other people's solutions or developing your own. So I don't know if it's one specific feature, but those small hiccups along the way they can add up and they can end up slowing you down, or you may not have to rely on those features, and then you reap the benefits of hybrid and see an increase in speed of development. So I think it kind of just, again, depends on what you need and doing that research beforehand to make sure that you're capable of doing it.
Yeah. Gentlemen, any thoughts to add to that? Nathan?
I would say that we spent time on that initial project when we didn't know what we were doing, and we probably had to customize at that time because this was early on in that cross-platform, solution. We spent time probably customizing 30 to 40% of the code. We wrote it for iOS first, and then we had to go back and make it fit onto Android. And we probably customized about 40% of that code to make it work correctly on that Android platform. So we did get it all working, and we did have the barcode scanning, and the camera worked for that, and the GPS did work, but it took a while to get that if statement, if iOS do this, else Android do this, and it was a lot of work. So
I think if I can hop in again really quickly, I think that also comes down on another important point about using hybrid or cross-platform solutions is that oftentimes you will have to rely on someone with a native experience because in order to write things specifically for iOS or Android, if it's not supported out of the box by React Native or Flutter or any of these other popular frameworks, you'll have to, again, resort to your native experience. And if you just don't have that experience or that perspective, it can be hard to customize it according to each platform.
Yeah, that's certainly something to consider. Yeah, thanks for that. That was a great question. Thank you. Let's make it a little more interesting. I guess we'll start with Ken. Care to share with us one or two of the key learnings on your journey?
I think the first thing that comes to mind when talking about my own journey is the product market fit, and making sure that even before all this discussion of a mobile app, that you have interviewed your customers enough to know that they actually need a mobile app or want a mobile app to solve the problem that you want them to be solving. But I think that's a little outside of the scope of our discussion today. As far as the technological side goes, I again go back to sort of what stage is the maturity of your team and your technical team and the project at, and making a decision of how to go about choosing which native, progressive or hybrid approach you take based on the constraints, and not being, and I think, so I've had discussions with my CTO at Dakota about how if he were making the decision today to go, mobile and which approach to take, that he would take the hybrid approach, because we do have a lot of, we have to have an Android team and an iOS team to do those two things right now. And as a small 5-person startup, that is a lot of the resources being dedicated just to engineer those two native platforms. And so if we could have had someone, do the one size-fits-all approach, then that would help our speed of development a lot. And even if the experience might have been 80% of what it is today, that if we had 50% more features because of that, that speed of development would have been worth it. And I think at the time I chose user experience over how many features we could get out there, which is something that we still, I mean, it sort of, the ship has sailed at this point, but it's something that I think if I could go back and look at that again, I might tell myself something differently in terms of choosing something that gets our MVP out there faster and pushes everything that we wanted out there faster.
Yeah, wow, that's a big one there, and it's trade-offs, and because our platforms and technologies are evolving so fast, sometimes what would have been a perfect decision at the time, not that it was entirely a bad one, by concentrating on user experience, because there are gains there, it's always evolving. So yeah, it's tricky. Connor?
Yeah, so this kind of ties in a little bit to the last question too, which is, some of my biggest successes also come with the hardest lessons as well. One of my first apps was an e-commerce, a local e-commerce app, kind of like a Craigslist for, specific trade goods. And I went native with iOS. It was an iOS only app. And, but I did rely heavily on a service called Parse for my backend. And, about a year or so, I think after development, Parse shut down. Facebook pulled the rug from under Parse. And I was kind of stuck in a position where I was relying on a technology that was going to go open source, but it was no longer supported by Facebook. So I think that the hardest lesson is definitely don't be afraid to branch out, but be prepared to have a solution built in if something is to change. And I think that that's one of the biggest concerns when you're talking about using something that isn't native, is at what point could Google or Facebook decide, we no longer want to support Flutter or React Native. Those are they're huge technologies, but technologies do come and go. But one thing you can be sure of is that there's always going to be some native solution that isn't going to be just completely different from what you've been previously doing. Again, it's unlikely, but it does happen. And something as big as React Native, or Flutter, they could disappear or become open source and less supported. So definitely the hardest lesson that I've learned is to have a backup plan and be prepared from a technical standpoint to not tie yourself into one technology and not, marry your product to one specific technology to the point where it needs like a full rewrite or something along those lines. So that would be my hardest lesson. But again, you learn from it and you move forward. And I definitely have not made the same mistake.
Yes, indeed. Never want to paint yourself into a corner with those dependencies. Nathan, what do you have for us?
Well, I've got a lot of red marks on my backside from over the years. So I guess one thing I would comment on first of all is do not treat mobile differently than you do other things inside your business. We specifically take care of it and don't forget about it and sit it on a shelf, and make sure you are looking at those feedback items and comments and ratings and reviews. And if it's not going the way it should, then take a stance and make a change quickly, efficiently. Do something different. Don't be afraid to step out on a limb and make changes, is what I would say, because users use these tools in a way that they don't use the other suite of tools in your enterprise. They're not on there a long time. They're not on this mobile app to do 20 minutes of things, unless you're on TikTok or Facebook and you're wasting tons and tons of your life by doing something silly, which that's my wife, but she does that. She's not on here, so I can say that. But they're on our app, enterprise app such as Edward Jones, to look at their finances and catch a glimpse of it. And they don't want it to crash. They want it to be robust, see what they need to see, or make a transaction, and they get off. So that's what I would say. Just really pay attention to these things, and don't be afraid to fail, but pick yourself up and do something over again.
Yeah. I can, yeah, that's sound advice. Thank you, gentlemen. That's great. That's good stuff. I guess we kind of discussed, it kind of flowed into this, what worked for each approach. I know that Nathan kind of talked about the store, the application he worked for, the store. Ken has kind of covered with us a decision he made by focusing on user experience and having to juggle both iOS and Android. And if he would probably do it differently today. And Connor's also talked about his experiences as well. Do you guys have anything else that you think we could cover that talks about what scenarios work for each? Did we miss anything or something you'd like to add?
I'll jump in here a little bit. So in this situation with me, there's Edward Jones, a big enterprise. When I started, we didn't have much in the way of mobile solutions, especially internal applications. And my previous employer, we had tons and tons of mobile applications in the distribution centers, in the warehouses, in the stores, in the checkout lines, all over the place. So at Jones, now we're starting to build out some enterprise approaches. And at first we had a stance that everything was going to be iOS only because that's what our mobile MDM supported, mobile iron and so on. So we can distribute, things to the enterprise, and we could allow BYOD solutions. Well, that might be changing. So now some of our enterprise stuff, we might be, open to a React Native or a new tool set. Instead of just doing iOS only, it was pretty easy to make a decision. Let's do native development. We only support iOS. Now I'm going to have to say, okay, what are we going to build next? If we support Android next year in the future, we might do a cross-platform tool to do some of our development for enterprise apps. If I go out to the App Store with a customer-facing app, I'm probably going to do native unless it's something that I really could quickly get out in a hybrid approach that's going to do something minimalistic. If it's going to be robust and do a whole bunch of things, it's probably going to be a native application. So.
Yeah. All right. Good stuff. Just to kind of unpack a little bit there. You mentioned MDM and BYOD. Again, for the less technically inclined, just a few quick stabs at it. Could you kind of just let guys know what that is or explain it a little?
Yeah. So BYOD model in the enterprise means you can bring your own device. And MDM is a mobile device management solution. Mobile Iron is the one we were using, and we still kind of are. We're switching to Intune. There's a whole bunch of players in this space. Basically, it means coming to the office, we can give you some things on your mobile device, your personal device, or some enterprises choose to buy their own devices and build them out with an MDM for things like, ordering in the distribution center. Or I know Enterprise does the rental car software on their, I think they use Google devices or Android devices. And they build a tool set for you to be able to, I went in an Enterprise store one time, and the whole kiosks that they do their ordering on was down, and all they had was the tablets on a cell network that day, but they still worked just fine. Everybody, come on, we'll check you out. No problem. We don't need these computers. We got our tablets. So that's what MDM type solution is. So.
Right. That's great. And, just to kind of give an example of how, companies, I know from my mind, when you talk about that enterprise example, from a user experience perspective, having the device kind of created, gave way to a more interactive session with the customer. So they'd be able to walk with you to the car and kind of walk around and do all that stuff and sign right on site. And it was more engaging. So that's just kind of an example there. Good stuff. Thanks. Yeah, that's a good one.
And related to this question, we have a question from the audience. Are there different frameworks for different types of applications that help guide that approach?
I can speak to this a little bit because this kind of does tie into the current question as well. I don't necessarily think that there is a huge framework change if you were going to build something that's heavily location-based versus something that might just be reading and writing simple data. I think that you can kind of have like a little mental checklist when you're thinking about starting a project. If this is a simple application that you need to get out quickly, if you already have a current website, or if you have developers in-house that are really familiar with JavaScript and web development, and again, it's a simple application at first, at least, a progressive web app might be the way to go. because you can easily convert a website or build a website out and allow it to be downloaded into multiple devices from different browsers. If you rely really heavily on any native functionality or any functionality on a phone at all, I think that it'd probably be best to go native, just because things are constantly changing. You're always going to be up to date and have access to the latest APIs and technologies. If you're somewhat in the middle, or maybe you're reading and writing a lot of data, but you also need location, you could look at a hybrid or cross-platform approach. But as far as I need X feature, so I'm choosing Y framework, I don't think there's a scenario that I have used or can think of off the top of my head where I would choose a specific framework based off of one feature. I would kind of look at the entire package and go from there. So that would be my answer to that.
That's great. That was a really good question, because it really dovetails into the next one, which are some of the tactics for mobile use case for the different approaches. And I know we've been kind of covering some of these. Ken, talk and go forward here. What are some of your secrets?
Yeah, I think the tactic to do is to take a very analytical and logical approach, which would be to weigh the pros and cons. And I think the diagram that 1904 has developed, that I was looking at right before this meeting or before this session, is really useful to, in a more tabular format, say, okay, here are all the things we want to look at, and what do we need to figure out ahead of time. And I think all the things that we've covered, like whether that's the user experience or what developers you have access to, there's a whole host of about a dozen things to really look at, and to do that in a logical way. Whether that's with, if you have engineers on hand, that's great. If you need someone to help you with that, whether 1904 or some other companies providing that service, I think that that would be the way to do it, so that you have a very holistic and quantitative way to analyze your needs, and then to do it. But yeah, I think for us, again, we looked at it internally, and I think my skew towards user experience shaped our decision heavily, which, I talked about whether that was the right thing to do, maybe, or not at that time. But we did look at it very analytically. And I think just because of, my desire for that experience, as opposed to, a strong technologist voice saying, hey, like, our resources really aren't that big right now, and so we really should focus on being scrappy. And if you raise $1 million later on, we're just going to rewrite this in the native platform, so why don't you adopt that strategy and think about it that way. I think that would have really helped with our decision making.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Ken. Yeah, the research, the artifact that we've been discussing is still a living document. It is ongoing research that goes on, and please do reach out. Some of you who are watching this, please do reach out to 1904 Labs. Let's have a conversation, and let's try and all figure out this stuff together. Let's see if we can help you out. And as for Ken, I've got to tell you, user experience is a really sound guiding light to go by. There are a lot of products, when you think about any product or thing that you use or you're absolutely loyal to, it really, they talk about from cradle to grave, right? That adoption, high adoption, is really important. And user experience is part of getting them to adopt and understanding that user experience. So it's really good stuff. Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I think I'll just really quickly follow up on my answer there, which is, I think, we as the panelists met before this, and we sort of came to the conclusion that all of us would prefer to do a native project if given the time and resources to do so. I'll give two stories or counterexamples to it that we've run into on the Dakota side real quick, which is that the first one is that so again, with our underserved, low socioeconomic status population, that some of the patients that we're working with, that downloading from the App Store is a challenge, because they sometimes don't have, they're not in a stable place to have an email address that you need to use to sign up for the App Store account to then actually be able to download from the App Store. And so that's certainly something to consider as well, in terms of, we talked about the distribution method. And so having an App Store account and needing a credit card to be able to link to that App Store account. Like those are things that you need to consider if your user base has and if they find that convenient. Which a progressive web app probably, I mean, if it's distributed through just the internet or web browser, then it doesn't have that problem. And the other one is similarly, we've heard from customers, we're offering a telehealth solution, like a video telehealth solution, right? And it requires them to download the app. And some of the providers are like, well, I can just send out a link to one of these other competing services that offer telehealth, and the customer does not have to go through the hassle of downloading the app just to engage in a telehealth solution with me, right? Yeah. And so that convenience, again, we talk about a superior user interface experience and a fluidity and elegance upgrade by going native, but there are definitely barriers to, there are costs to having that elegance because you have to download the application now, and that is a big thing that you have to consider for depending on how heavyweight the tasks that you're trying to do are.
Yeah, that's. I mean, being able to look at all those different things is something that happens, and your decision today could change tomorrow. But it's about having the right tooling and decision guide, or having the right tools or mindset when you go about trying to tackle some of these problems, because problems do evolve and change. Gentlemen, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Alexandra, are there any other questions? We'll open it up to the audience.
Yes, and if anyone does want to be unmuted to ask a question, just put that in the chat window and I'm happy to unmute you. For now, everyone is muted, so use the chat window primarily. We did get some other questions. What are some of the latest trends in mobile development that our panelists could talk about?
I'll let you guys.
Yeah, I would say right now Swift UI is a big trend on the iOS side. I think Connor mentioned that earlier. It's the new way to lay out your applications without storyboards. I think that's an interesting thing. It gets you a little more into coding your user interface instead of laying it out the way it used to. So that's a big trend. I think a lot of people are excited about. We haven't jumped in all the way because of our support level at Edward Jones is not quite ready for that as a maturity thing, but won't be long. We are doing POCs with that. I think that last question, I like to take an app, a small app, and do POCs with it across different technologies to see how different technologies work. Especially if you have some sort of test app that you're testing things with, it's always good to do like a Kotlin or a Swift app or even a cross-platform one to see how they all function.
Yeah, I like it.
I can also speak to one that will most likely become a trend. It's not quite out yet because it gets released when the next iOS version comes out. But a new feature that Apple is releasing is called Apple Clips. It basically allows people to scan something like a QR code outside of a business, or it can use your location and determine when you're within a certain radius of one of these Apple clips. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to get a brief set of functionality for an app that you have not downloaded yet. So say I was a business like a restaurant or something and I drove by it, an app clip might be recommended by Siri, and it could have something like a quick order now button, and then that could also point you to download the full app. So there's definitely going to be a trend there, especially I think in retail and brick and mortar stores, places with hard locations. I think you're going to start seeing them use app clips. I think there's a lot of cool stuff you can do there with geolocation as well. So that's definitely a trend that isn't there yet, but it's coming for sure, at least for iOS.
Nice. Try before you buy. Alexandra, any more?
Could you tell us maybe about a time that you made a bad decision when you were designing or developing a mobile app? And maybe reflecting on why you made that decision, how you recovered from it, whether that's choosing the wrong approach or some other element of the design and development.
I can go ahead, or you can go first, Nathan, if you like.
I can tell you that I think being immature in our testing of mobile applications at one point. There was some features in the release mechanism of Apple where you can actually roll out your app very slowly. It's called a phase release. We were not using those, and we went out to all of our customers at one time, and we had a defect that absolutely broke everyone. And we scurried to get a release out to Apple that day to fix that. But if we would have used the phased approach and paused it, we would have only crippled ourselves on a few people's devices instead of everyone that had auto updates turned on. So sometimes it's not about what you do inside the application, it's what you do when you're actually giving it to people that is the problem.
Right. Yeah, that's good. Good
Yeah,
stuff.
and then I guess one that I've experienced is buying into technologies too early without experimenting with them first. So to get a little bit more technical, there's a library called RX Swift, which is kind of a trend with iOS. With the release of Combine, we're seeing more of a reactive approach to developing apps. And you know, before diving into including a big library like RX Swift into your project, I think it's important to have those spikes, have those discussions about requirements, and make sure that you're not just using or forcing a technology into your stack when it's not needed. And so I think definitely a big mistake is again just buying into certain frameworks or libraries before you fully understand the entire picture of what you're trying to build.
Gentlemen, this has been fantastic. Alexandra?
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us and for your questions. Really appreciate you making this a lively discussion, and great job to our panelists. We are going to be coming out with an ebook related to that decision guide that I linked in the chat window and that we will email out afterwards. So keep an eye out for that. We're also offering free mobile strategy sessions related to that decision guide. So reach out to us if you're interested in that. Follow us for more on modern software and mobile development at 1904 Labs. We'll be probably coming out with some more webinars in the near future. Lastly, please connect with our panelists on LinkedIn. I will be dropping let me just drop their links to their LinkedIn profiles into the chat window. Feel free to connect with them. Other than that, thank you everyone. That concludes it for the day. Thank
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.